All right, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. So today is another iteration of our API review backlog. So I think I want to start with this one here. At least that's the one that now I also have to think about how to pronounce the names correctly. Steven asked me to review yesterday. So do you want to talk about it, or is I think Jeff is also on the call, right?
I can talk to it. Jeff's also here. It's pretty simple. Basically, when you derive from stream, you need to override a variety of methods. You generally end up overriding read, write, read async, write async, begin read, begin write, all of which take the same arguments, a byte buffer, an int offset, and an int count. And you need to validate all those arguments. So you do it in at least 6 places in each stream type. And if you look at .NET Runtime, we've got, 20, 30, 40 of these things, each of which either duplicates all that code multiple times or creates its own helper, or we create one for the repo and then, end up using that. But invariably, when they each do their own, they end up doing it slightly differently and we get different behavior. And so the proposal here is simply to add a protected helper to stream for argument validation. So that any derived type can just call it rather than doing its own, and to have one for the arguments to the read and write methods, and then one for the copy to async methods.
So I assume the contract. Sorry, go ahead.
These are just throwing all the right exceptions with the right names and messages.
Yeah, so I mean, yes, there's some haziness there in that different streams sometimes do it slightly differently, in particular when validating that the offset and count don't exceed the length of the buffer. Sometimes they end up throwing argument out of range exception. Sometimes they end up throwing the base argument exception. Sometimes they include the name of one of the parameters. Sometimes they don't. So the proposal here is to just do argument out of range exception for that joint condition, and probably to include the parameter name of count as the sort of, we just declared that's the one that's is wrong. And it's possible there could be some breaking changes there, but I don't think it's a big deal. Especially since we'd be changing, worst case, something that was argument exception to something that was argument out of range exception. We fixed up a few tests that we're doing assert throws instead to be assert throws any instead, etc. The other thing is there are some derived types that do the wrong thing with regards to they override and specify a different name, like network stream calls int count and instead overrides it and calls it int size. And some of streams override it, and instead of calling it byte buffer like the base, they call it byte array. I was talking offline with Emo and Eric St. John and Jeff, and I think for .NET 6, we should accept the breaking change and go through and fix all of them to conform, because it ends up being really strange. Well, first, this helper becomes less useful if you can't use it in all those places. But secondly, it's really strange when you're generally using stream versus via the base class, and you end up getting parameter names that don't make any sense because they don't show up in the base class. It also leads to weirdness if you're using like dynamic or something, because then if you try and specify a name parameter at the call site, you have to use the one from the derived type, even though you have no idea what the derived type actually is if you're just getting back a stream. So the proposal here is to just use the names of the base from the base type, and we go and fix up the likes of network stream to use the correct parameter names.
Sounds all reasonable to me. I mean, this is introducing a protected member to make up for the fact that it didn't use the template method pattern in the first place, but it puts us in a better state. We can't get to where we should have been.
So I guess my question is, I mean, I understand why we want this API, but like, why is stream special? Don't we have the same problem in many other places, or is that because we didn't use the template pattern, that's why we have that problem?
I mean, we probably have a similar one in text writer and some other common base types. This one is particularly interesting because It's pretty common to derive from stream. It's abstract. You're forced to override these methods because they're all abstract. Well, most of them end up being abstract. And so everyone just sort of left to their own devices does their own thing. It's possible we'd want to go and do something with other types as well. But we've been doing a lot of stuff with stream lately, and this popped.
Yeah, my guess is it's that it doesn't do the template pattern. It is extended often, and this is the class that is held together with the most bailing wire and duct tape, in that it's gone through every notion of async that we've ever had, and then the spanification, and yeah, like every bad thing we've ever done to a type has been done to stream.
Yeah, I guess my question is that the pattern we want? Like, do we think that having validate methods is the right pattern? Because basically, I guess the contract is they just throw, right? So like if they succeed, they return nothing. And I think part of the value is that it throws the right exception, puts in the right argument names, all that stuff, right? So I guess if we approve these APIs, is this the pattern we would do elsewhere as well? I guess is my question.
I think it's the pattern we want as a retrofit, but the guidelines say template method pattern to avoid this problem.
Yeah, that's why I was asking, like, whether we had this problem elsewhere. I mean, like, I understand the stream is very complicated, but I can easily see this problem being in other cases, right? Because you can only future-proof so much, so you will invariably have this problem eventually.
What are you proposing, or what do you think of? What are you thinking of as the alternative, Emo?
I don't have an alternative. I'm just basically saying, like, if this is the pattern we want for argument validation, is this basically what we think is the right model? So, for example, would we say we have static helper methods on the type, or would we have, similar to the contract stuff, where we have a centralized place on where we put this as static helpers? So that's my only question.
I would put this on the type just because the parameter names match the signatures that are prevalent on this type. If you look at, I think Steve brought up other types like text reader, text writer. Those tend to use either different parameter names or slightly different signatures in a lot of their cases. So if we were to create helpers for that type, I would imagine it would be on that type itself.
Yeah, I mean, like the byte int, right? That can be called buffer, array, buff, data. The int is offset or start offset, or index. Count is count for length size.
And we're so good at this. We've used all of those across the board.
Yeah, it's the combinatoric.
That's the saving grace, right? That stream is self-consistent.
Yeah. So
what is the copy?
Can you pass the parameter names there instead of depending on the name we got?
I mean, we could add more parameters, but
yeah,
at some
so
point.
you can have more control, and you make sure that you're throwing the right name all the time.
I mean, that's kind of the problem, though, right? Like, I mean, as Steven said, like, apparently we're not very consistent in our hierarchy today. I guess point of these APIs would be that you don't get to choose the name, so you can't mess it up.
Yeah, I think that if we had it as a general public helper somewhere, we would have to do that, and then it takes so many parameters that you're like, I'll just do it myself. Yeah, I think that this is, like I said, I think it's a reasonable pattern for a retrofit. We certainly shouldn't be introducing new types that do this because we have other guidelines that are existing.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me the prefix and the suffix makes sense. The question is just like, do we know, like, is it obvious from the method names because they're basically tied to a particular signature, right? So like, is it clear which methods they apply to? Like copy to kind of makes sense, right? It's the copy to method. The buffer arguments applies to probably all the read methods, right?
I mean, we could call it validate read write arguments or something. It applies to basically applies to any of the methods on stream that accept an array effectively.
Right. And do we have the same parameter names everywhere already?
Thankfully, on the base class, yes.
Yes. That is the huge saving grace here.
Yeah, that makes sense then. I think then, yeah, you want to reuse it across everything that takes a buffer, so then not having the method names in there makes sense.
Question, why does validate copy to arguments take a source? That doesn't match the signature of any API that's on stream.
So the idea, and I allude to this in one of the comments, basically copy to validation isn't just about arguments, it's also about the state of the source and destination stream, whether they're readable, writable, disposed, etc. And there's this complicated set of logic that goes through to say, like, you know, if the source isn't readable, but the destination is writable, then throw this. If the source is readable, but the destination isn't writable, then throw that. So it needs access to the source, basically this. So we would, if assuming we want to do this, we have two options. Basically, it's static and you pass in this as the first argument, or it's an instance method and it's, you know, it just uses this internally. I went back and forth on that and decided it was better for it to be consistent from a static perspective with the other validation method, but I don't feel strongly about it.
So one of the differences then between these two methods is validate copy to can also throw invalid operation exception or invalid state exception, whatever it is, whereas validate
or object disposed exception too.
Yeah, but validate buffer arguments can't, because validate buffer arguments knows nothing about the state of the object that it's operating on. So why the difference between those two methods?
Because there's more to validate in.
Yeah, if the thing that you're supposed to pass for source is always this, I would just make it instance. I mean, it's the same thing.
I guess the other thing I'm getting at is valid if it's important to check, is a stream readable, is a stream writable, is the object disposed? If it's important to check that inside of copy to, why is it not also important to check that inside of validate buffer arguments?
It's a fair question. I think the answer is it's just historically what's been done in these methods. Whoever wrote the initial set of copy to methods did all these checks, and it just proliferated. And whoever wrote the initial set of read write methods didn't necessarily. So, I mean, we could choose to add, you know, a can read check, but then we would need to distinguish. We would need two validation methods, one for read arguments and one for write arguments. And you'd need to validate that, you know, the can read and the can write and the write. I mean, we could also just say we're not going to do the copy to one and you're on your own. That one, though, if you look at the helper that we compile into every method in .NET Run, or every copy to and copy to async in .NET Runtime, it's the big one. Like, that's the one that's the hardest to get around.
Yeah, it's also worth pointing out that most streams know, you know, whether they are readable or writable, so there's no need to validate that in validate buffer arguments.
Yeah, like just do the operation, and if something's not readable or writable, it'll just fail, right?
No, I mean like you know, a network stream is always readable and writable unless it's been disposed, right? So there's no point in checking can read and can write because they're always going to return true in that case. Or buffer arguments. I guess you could make a similar argument for copy to arguments. I don't know.
I mean, I guess it sounds like the statement really is just we have the consistent, or at least should have been consistent, argument null exception for buffer, offset is negative, count is negative, offset exceeds buffer.length, the combination of offset and count exceeds the space remaining in buffer. And then the various things that the methods do are just not as consistent at that point, especially across our entire hierarchy. Whereas copy to, we're fairly consistent, so we're just going to go ahead and lock that in as a pattern, or lock that in as a utility method.
Essentially, that's the argument, yeah. And again, I realize, I mean, Levi has a very valid point that these two methods are kind of doing different scopes of validation. At the same time, we built this stream helpers.copy2 argument validation.cs file into every one of our assemblies because they're all doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe that logic could be simplified. Maybe we could say, it's not worth doing these extra can read, can write checks. Just delegate and so be it. I think one of the reasons that doesn't happen is so that early errors can be surfaced synchronously from async calls. So like if the destination stream isn't writable, you generally don't find that out in copy2 async until you're already doing the copy. You've already read from the source. You're already running asynchronously. Any exception is going to be surfaced as part of the task. And so like you've already mutated stuff and you're no longer able to propagate the exception synchronously.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that makes sense. I mean, I guess the only thing is, I mean, what would we have done differently? We would have added a validate read buffer and validate write buffer method that also takes the stream and would do the additional read and write checks on the stream itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, or be instance instead of static, where it just gets to this. Yeah, so this seems reasonable if we're gonna, but once we're taking like we change some arguments, breaking change. I wonder if there's some like a couple exceptions maybe get thrown in a different order, but they're all basically argument and state exceptions, so they shouldn't matter anyway. And we go ahead and codify. This is, validate read arguments, and this is validate write arguments. And I guess the problem is we still the object exposed exception and stuff in most of our streams now. Those are probably actually in the span and memory ones, and the buffer ones are just validating the arguments to get the names right and then calling the span ones.
Right.
So we do have different scopes on them. Like copy2 does the work, and the byte array things aren't the ones that do work on our modern classes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, to some extent on our newer stream implementations, where you, like as you were saying, that delegate from the byte array ones to the memory ones, like the only reason this validation function is used is to get the right argument names in the exception that's thrown. Memory annoyingly uses different names for its arguments, and for, I guess, perf reasons, it doesn't actually include the names in the exceptions that are thrown, at least some of them. So the point of this is just purely usability. We could also choose to make a decision and say, you know what, we don't care about usability for this stuff. Just emit the extra checks, and you get an exception that actually stems from memory, so be it.
Yeah, so I think I would do what's proposed, except validate copy2. I would make instance, just so there's never a weird state where somebody passes something other than this is the first parameter.
So the other thing we could do is we could just get rid of the source argument, and then the issue goes away completely, right? I mean, I'm just looking at that. What I think is the actual implementation here. Is it Stephen? Is it really just checking can read? Because maybe just for consistency, we should just drop the can read check and do that manually. And as I said, some implementations may not even need to check that because they already know that, assuming they're not disposed, that they are in fact readable, and they can just elide that check completely.
We could. I don't have the implementation in front of me. I'm walking my dog right now, but this is a good time to do it. But there are some of the checks in that method combined, like with checks on destinations can write. Like I don't remember exactly, but there's some logic about whether one or both of the can read, can writes return false, and using that to determine whether to throw an invalid operation exception, naming the source, the destination, or throwing an object disposed exception instead. And I don't remember the exact details, but if someone wants to look it up, it's in that stream helpers file.
Yeah, I was just.
But I'm sorry.
Let me post it.
Yeah, I have to say, like, I'm not a fan of Jeremy's idea of making them instance methods. I think for algorithm validation, I would probably prefer them to be static, so it's clear what you're actually passing in. As soon as you have an instance method, it might check, everything in the world.
No. This is only for validate copy to, where source is always passed as this.
Sure, same argument. Like, I would say, like, I would just prefer everything that is validated would be static, I guess.
Yeah, just Stephen, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the code, but it looks like we check, the only thing we check source can read and we check source can write. If they're both false, we throw object disposed. If only source can read is false, then we throw unreadable stream.
Yeah. So, and again, like we're more open to this level of change between versions. If we wanted to establish that, like, we just, always throw not supported exception, and if you want to do anything else, you do it before the call, I guess before the call. I'm okay with that. I mean, it does mean we'll have some, differences about which exception gets thrown first. If you pass an invalid buffer and you're on a disposed stream, I don't really think that matters. We have multiple things that are so long, like we can melt up one of them. I don't think it really matters which.
I don't think that we need to care too much about the ordering. If you've got multiple argument type exceptions, preserving the order doesn't seem important.
Right, but the one between the object disposed exception and the not supported exception, assuming that that's written because streams, when they dispose, set both their can reads and can writes to false, like, that means that anything that's getting an ODE now would get a not supported exception, which would be a bad change.
Yeah, the issue here, though, that logic that's there is a little bit iffy, because this isn't the same stream that's the source and the destination. So just because they're both false doesn't actually mean that they were disposed. Second, you would think that we consistently set the can methods of can properties to false after the stream has been disposed, but we do not.
Oh, I don't actually think we do. I'm just saying, anyone that's actually using this logic, you would change the order of where if you get the object disposed exception, which tells you have a lifetime management problem, or a not supported exception, which you're like, where did this come from and what happened? It's just that changing an object disposed exception to a not supported exception feels like if we let that go through, that would be a breaking change that I don't think we can justify. Like, it makes it harder to diagnose things, and we did it just to reduce an argument in a helper function. So, yeah, I would. Yeah, I mean, again, my feedback is I would make validate copy to arguments. Instance, I assume this one's static because the current helper is static, and the current helper has to take this as a formal parameter because it's on a different type. So,
yeah, I did it this way. I actually did it this way. I went back and forth about whether to propose it as such, and I did it just to figure if someone's, looking for validation, they find stream.validate buffer arguments, then they have the other validation methods in the same list.
That's fair.
Yeah, it seems weird to have one static and one instance, just from a discoverability point of view. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, do we want to do a weird thing and name source at this to be like past this?
Again, if the consternation here is about source, let's just remove source. I don't think there's any, I think there's a reasonable argument to be there that gives us a couple things. First of all, we're not dealing with the issue of what to call this and how to think about it. Second of all, it has a nice symmetry here where validate copy to arguments takes the same arguments that copy to takes, just like validate buffer arguments takes the same arguments that read takes.
Sure, but then
and
the 4 other throws have to move somewhere.
yeah, but no, there's not 4. There's 2, right?
There's 2 object disposed exceptions and 2 not supported exceptions.
Yeah, but we can still do the object. We can still do the 2 checks on the destination, right? It's just the source we can't do the checks on. And I think there's a reasonable argument to be made here that a stream knows its own state. It knows whether it's readable. It knows whether it's disposed. It knows how to check those things properly, whereas we don't, right? We don't necessarily know, as Steven said, we're kind of, faking the dispose check because we can't actually check whether something is disposed or not. So let's just remove the source argument, and require that callers need to do that themselves if they need to. Most of them are probably checking disposed here anyway, right? Because
but after this, which means you're changing the order of a not supported exception and an object disposed exception.
yeah,
This being disposed currently throws before destination can't write.
I think what we'd actually do is in general, it would be changing the order between object disposed and say argument. Yeah, basically we would do the object disposed check first before making this validation call.
Yeah.
Fair.
And remember that we're only throwing ODE on the source if can read and can write return false, which I'm pretty sure is far from always the case when we dispose.
Sure.
In our own streams, it's far from the case. I can only imagine other people's as well. Like we are far from consistent.
Indeed. I know I've written many a stream that can read just returns true. And then the read throws object disposed, because it's never clear what you're supposed to do with these properties. Okay, so Steve, your suggestion is that the dispose check trumps the argument checks.
My suggestion is really that it kind of doesn't matter. That if you're validating your arguments and the destination says it can't write, well, it's up to you whether you want to prefer that over you saying, well, I'm disposed or not.
Yeah.
And
I think
I don't know
canonically our state is, the argument exceptions, then the object disposed exceptions, then other things.
Yeah, and so if we did that, then yeah, you could end up throwing in a situation where we would have been throwing a not supported, but an object disposed was still possible. We might end up throwing them in the reverse order. And I think in general we're okay with that level of quote unquote break.
So a question I have is, why is validate copy arguments validating that this is not disposed, but validate buffer arguments isn't?
I think that was Levi's question.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's okay. He didn't state it exactly that. That's how I interpreted his question. And I think it's purely historical that, like, there's really no, to Jeff's point, there's really no need for these validation methods to do it because the caller is going to do it in one way, shape, or form, or not. Whereas whoever wrote the initial copy to did this long series of checks, and then we ended up putting that into a helper and propagating that to every stream that we have. And so for us, it's just sort of become the canonical thing to do these checks. And then rather than adding the separate this checks at the call site, it's just baked into that one helper that everyone ends up using. I don't have a better explanation than that.
Yeah, so history.
So what I'm hearing now is we remove the source parameter from the second one, and we leave them both as static. Is that a fair summary?
I think so.
That sounds good to me.
Yep.
Yeah, we'll have to, all the places that are using the current helper will have to figure out what we want to happen for the object disposed. And to Steve's point of guessing as to why someone did it this way, I think that it's doing more upfront checks because just because it can verify that it's in an okay state, if it calls read on the local thing before calling write on the destination, but destination was disposed, you've now lost data out of this. Like, if we delay those checks, we change what exceptional behavior does to side effects.
Right. No, I think it's important to validate. I think it's important to validate destination.can right before doing the reads on the source. So,
Yeah.
but we don't lose that by removing this from the signature.
I mean, as a general rule of thumb, it seems reasonable to me that the first thing a method does is validating its argument and then validating its own state, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think I like the pattern that validate XXX arguments only deals with actual arguments. And then if the method wants to do any sort of validation on itself, then it would do that after the fact.
Yeah, I guess really for me, the whole weirdness here is that the original implementation decided it's a not supported exception when destination can't write, as opposed to an argument exception if it needs a writable stream.
Right.
So,
yeah, this goes back to we're not very consistent.
This is pure speculation. I bet this came about because this validation didn't initially exist, and then not supported exceptions started getting thrown in the middle of the implementation. And so someone said, well, let's just move that not supported exception from the middle of the implementation to the start, and no one questioned the type of exception being thrown.
Yeah, well, it was probably we're fixing the bug of you get a not supported exception, but you lost data. It's like, well,
exactly. Yeah.
We can't change which catches fire, so. All right.
Cool. Then let me just
I guess I'm on board with that. I can certainly agree that there's probably very little consistency in the current object disposed state, but we should preserve the one for destination in case it matters.
Yeah, separately from just in general, I've been looking at a bunch of types recently with this in mind, and we are all over the map as to whether argument state is validated before instance state, especially for disposed state. So if that's something we want to look at more generally, it might be fruitful.
Fair enough. In my head, first parameter null check is almost always the first line of code.
No, I agree with you.
All right, so then this was easy. Only 40 minutes.
Well, it was mostly a compat discussion instead of an API discussion.
That is also true.
Compat's always hard.
Only if you care. I've been told that Semver fixes all compat issues.
Emo, can I request we do the HP3 one real quick? It should. I swear, if it takes more than 2 minutes, we can defer it later.
Which one is that? HTTP. This one here?
Yeah, that one.
Totally.
We need new static defines for HB version 3.0 and the corresponding ALPN name for HB3.
Yeah, if we wanted to, I think we could not do the SSL application protocol API. I don't actually know who we expect to use this. I only added it for consistency with the existing ones.
Don't we need it in quick? Aren't we passing the ALPN there as SSL application protocol?
Well,
You
yeah,
can't use
but we
SSL
can
stream
just
though, can
have
you?
our own static internally. There's really no need for a public API. I guess it lets us share the instance with between Kestrel and HTTP client, but the memory savings there aren't really compelling.
On the other hand, we did define it for HB2 as well and HB 1.1.
Yeah, so I mean, for consistency, sure, but like if we wanted to, I think it's totally safe to leave off.
I mean, it's
So like Kestrel uses the HB2 one with SSL stream. I'm not sure, like we wouldn't be using SSL stream with the HB3, but
yeah, you still need to pass it into the quick layer. So same,
makes sense.
it'll be the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a byte array instead of a string, but it's just a typed constant. So I'd just go ahead and leave them both in. Seems fine as proposed to me.
Yep.
I think we historically made a mistake when we called things version 10, 11, and 20, but we'll feel that pain in a couple years.
Both of these are actual fields rather than properties.
Yep.
The existing ones are, yes.
Yeah,
We added those recently. Why did we do that?
The HTTP version has been around forever. The application protocol stuff, I don't know why we did it that way.
Maybe it was the last thing we did before we decided we would just go with the properties because we could lazily initialize them.
Yeah, I don't know. Must have been an oversight because we're usually pretty good at that.
Yeah. I sort of feel like HTTP 3 should be the same as the other HTTPs, but if we had a new unrelated protocol that it would be property, but I don't care too much. The IntelliSense groups things together, so we can fix forward or match style.
Yeah, are there actually benefits, or is it more like consistency that we want to have them properties?
Just consistency.
Well, so if they're fields, when let's say this gets up to 1,000 members, right? The fields means that the type initializer has to go build all 1,000 of them before any of them can get used.
I see.
In this case, they're probably just reading off of the read-only memory to the code page initialized data, so it's probably very cheap. But the more public read-only field or public static read-onlys you have, like that just slows down your type load. And if you have them all as lazy properties, then or you can do them as properties that are initialized in the initializer, and then once you see that that's a perf problem, you can start moving them to lazy initialize.
Right. Yeah.
So that's.
I don't think we have 1,000 of them. I mean, if we have dozens of them, then we're already like 30 years in the future, probably, right?
Right. Yeah, I know when we were revising the guidelines, this sort of came up because there's like known colors or something that's not an enum, and there was an example in the book talking about static read only, and then like I even gave an annotation that's like, here in the book we call this static read only. In reality, they're lazy initialized properties because oh my god, there are too many of them.
Makes sense.
I'm paraphrasing.
For copyright reasons.
There is a standard list of ALPN values that we could fill in there if we really wanted to.
Given how few members there are here, like I'm honestly not too worried about it. And if we really, really, really needed to, we can change the underlying implementation of the type in order to itself be static or be lazily evaluated. Like there are tricks we can pull if it comes down to it. They're horrible, but they work.
I don't really know a good way to lazy initialize a read-only field, but maybe I just don't want to.
You don't lazily initialize the field. You have the field act as a sentinel value, and then you have the instance itself read the sentinel value and do initialization in the constructor. It's a hack, but it makes it cheaper if you have lots of members that have to be initialized on construction.
I feel worse knowing what you proposed.
I'm just saying, I don't think we'll ever need to avail ourselves of that option, but it is there. Meanwhile, I would vote for just have consistency. This type's really not going to have all that many members on it.
Right. All right, so I think this one was the next on the list. I think Steven flagged this one, right? No, Jeff marked this one. Jeff, do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, sorry, which one is this?
This is
disconnect async. Disconnect async. We have one of the things we're trying to do in 6.0 is make sure we have the complete set of APIs in socket in terms of everything has a task-based version, everything has span and memory versions and cancellation token, etc. So this is a small gap that exists today. We have old style async and sync versions of disconnect but not a task base. So this is simply add the task base. I think if you scroll down, there's an updated proposal. Sorry, I should have put it at the top.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So this is just the existing iAsync result API converted to task with a cancellation token added.
Why is the cancellation token not defaulted?
It should be. We're right.
So what's the behavior of this? Does this wait for like the full fin act to occur or what?
No.
It depends on if you're on Windows or Linux.
Oh, does it really?
Yeah, if you're on Linux, it just closes and recreates the socket. And if you're on Windows, it actually waits for the whole time wait thing in TCP. So it can sit here for like 2 minutes.
Okay, so it is waiting for a graceful shutdown of the socket then on Windows.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I forget how socket extensions works. How's this supposed to work?
It's a type that we added, I think, so we could have a NuGet package for task compat with framework. We've actually talked about it in this group before and in the networking team of just not using the socket task extensions anymore and putting things directly on socket. We might consider doing that here. I think we'll have an issue in the near future to move all of these APIs directly onto socket.
Okay, so this was a thing that came up for, well, NetFX was still an open API ecosystem.
Yeah, there was some out-of-band magic that we pulled to make these happen. I mean, this is one of those where we did unnatural acts to make Ubing work.
Fair enough. Okay, I mean, if this is where the other things have gone, and we don't want to evaluate the architecture now, I was just curious because functionality via extensions is usually not possible. So.
If we're going to bring through an issue in the near future to add everything from socket task extensions to socket, I think it's worth kind of like going ahead with this, but kind of with the note that should we decide to move everything from socket task extensions to socket in this release, we move this one and delete it from socket task extension so we don't ship yet another obsolete method.
Yeah, I think that's a good.
Yeah, the socket task extension should, if all that stuff's being moved to sockets, then it should ship exactly as it did in 5. Like remove any new surface area from it.
Yeah. I mean, if you were to do it, right, probably what we should do is you should mark all the methods on socket task extensions as editor browsable never. And then effectively IntelliSense will be clean. And then we can just decide that.
Yeah, but why would we ship the 6.0 ref of this saying that we added a member?
Sure.
We would just say like, no, in 6 we didn't change this at all, except for marking it as EB never.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm just looking at the type right now. It has like 15 entries. To me, 15 or 16, I will not lose sleep over that. But yeah, we probably should.
A few other notes. This parameter should be named socket to be consistent with the other members on this type. Also, this should return value task instead of task to be consistent with the other members on this type.
I mean, it should return task because that's what our guidelines say.
Yeah, but if you actually look at all the other APIs on this type, the async APIs that don't take a cancellation token return task. The APIs that do take a cancellation token return value task.
Non-generic value task?
Correct. It actually depends on the API, but yes.
Right. Well, right. So, I mean, the guidelines, and since Steve's here, he can say if he disagrees with what he had me write in the book, is if it is not generic and you don't absolutely 100% need to do iValue task completion source, then you should use task instead of value task.
Right. I'm looking at the pattern that's already implemented on this type because normally I would agree with that, but I'm existing pattern on the type.
Well, but once they move back to socket, it's going to be a grab bag.
So just to summarize, pretty much all the methods that we've added here after value task existed have been returning value task, and for two reasons that I think make it such that it's not an exemption to the book guidelines. And that is, one, these are generally disconnect async, maybe not so much, but these are generally hot path, high performance APIs. Two, they are generally expected to be awaited directly rather than using continue with or blocking on them, since if you're using these, you're generally trying to write sort of a high throughput asynchronous scalable server. And I don't know if I said two or three, but the third reason is these are actually ones where we do use iValue task source under the covers. If you look at like the send and receive async ones, they're using a custom socket async event args that itself implements the right interfaces, and then we just reuse that instance over and over for all these operations. Disconnect async is a little odd in that you generally use it once, although on Windows you could theory use it multiple times. But we, even in cases like that, like connect, even though you generally only use connect once, we take the same socket async event args that was used for the connect, and then we reuse it for, which is the backing for its value task. We then reuse it for the subsequent receives. So it kind of fits into the exception to the guideline. That is, if you meet all these conditions, go ahead and use value task.
Okay.
So yes, we should use value task here.
Yeah, I like to think of the guideline as use task unless Steve says otherwise. Honestly, I'd like to think of the guideline as use task, but
the problem with the Steve rule is it depends on how Steve's feeling on any given day. But today I'm feeling very value task centric, so do it.
Does Steve take bribes?
Not when the call's being recorded.
You're right. I think you're ready to become a politician, Steve. You already have the right, the right responses.
Oh God, no.
All right.
This month and 2 months cannot be over soon enough.
Value task and yep, you got the default. It's not value task event, it's just value task.
Sorry, I was just copying and pasting something else. So what was the last one?
This parameter is named socket, not that.
In prior API reviews, we chose to not use defaulted cancellation tokens on the socket class for consistency with how it's specified elsewhere. I don't know if we want to continue doing that here.
I think we should not only keep adding the defaults, but go back and add defaults to places that it makes sense.
We definitely have defaults for
I think
others.
previously we added 2 overloads for everything.
No, we also have send async, which takes an optional cancellation token.
Do we? Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we said for existing method groups we did the overloading, but I think for new method groups we said screw it. I think that was the way we did it.
Okay.
At least that's what it looks like when I'm clicking through that. Yep. So yeah, I don't see a problem with making it optional because it's completely new method group. Seems clean.
Sounds good.
All right, then that one is done. Is Miriam on the call? She is. Then let's maybe do this one here. So she's not waiting for eternity here.
Yeah. Sorry, I was muted. Santi and I were looking at this, the 2 issues that you have listed, and just commented on the issue. And I don't think it would be kind of. It would probably won't be API approved today. I mean, there's a bunch of things. There's a little kind of exploration that needs to be done before like there is a certain risk for adding this insert API into extensions configuration. And I'll go through that. I'll start over. So basically, what the ask is here is that for us to be able to insert key value pairs, like in configuration values at the beginning of, like there's different ways that we can add config data, and like there's and we have different providers and extensions like command line, environment variable, environment through command line, through environment variables, and others, or like in memory. And when we have a combination of these data, what the ask here is that for us to be able to insert in the front of the list. So that's why the API is called insert. And if you scroll down to the usage, you'll see a bit more on it. So for example, it says if insert was not towards the end of the, after the code blob, it said if insert was not used here, let's say adding memory collection would add the data last rather than what they want, which is first. But what needs to be explored, that is, this API addition is not going to be kind of trivial. It might have breaking changes that we haven't explored yet. So I was going to propose to like probably leave it in your list, and then we can get back to it in another time. Once we have more.
Then let's do the following, because I mean, I don't really know how to track things as ready for review, but not quite. So I would just move it back to needs work, and then I think that's the easiest way to do it.
Sounds good.
And then I think, is the other one ready? This was the this one.
It's a similar thing. There's 2 comments on it since it. So David had a comment about this. Basically, what the ask here is that when you have configuration, you're doing configuration setup. There's if it's not, if the validation happens. So we use Microsoft extensions configuration, and then like on top of that, let's say there are libraries like ASP.NET hosting or options, but then configuration itself doesn't make sure, it doesn't have APIs for validation. And the only benefit to having this is for us to be able to not rely on startup and DI in order to get validation on configuration. So like what they're asking to add is a get required section API next to other APIs such as get section. And get section, what it does is that like it will give you, it will return you an instance with default properties if it actually didn't find them, which is sometimes not ideal. And I don't think, I can't think of a scenario where like this is not having this API is blocking, and that's why I added a question for the author asking what their specific use case is that wouldn't allow them to use existing approaches that I linked. So same kind of, the idea I had was probably, as you said, to switch this to API needs review, and we could look at it once they respond, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, I guess, up for you to decide. I think like we can give you an opinion on what we would do, but I think the general idea is that when it comes to API suggestions, like you make the determination whether you feel like that's a good API. If you believe it's not a good API, you should totally feel entitled to just reject it and say, I don't think it's a good API, and close it. Like if customers then start to escalate and they get really angry or whatever, then I think it's fine to say, okay, let's take another look at this. But We are usually like, I mean, our goal really is to just review the APIs that you think are good ideas, right? So
Yeah.
if you think it's not
So
a good
I
idea, then
apologize.
it's
Yeah,
easy.
I should have switched it over to needs work, but this is kind of like a quick summary of both.
I mean, like at a very high level, I think the idea of the API isn't bad. I just wouldn't do it as an interface extension, but that's maybe that ship has sailed on extensions anyway. We usually would do these things as extensions so we don't break people who implement the interface. And it seems like this would be something that you could implement over the existing interface because you would just check and then throw, presumably, right?
One idea, yeah. I think Santi and I were thinking probably if there is something called binder options. I'm not sure exactly if it would. Yeah, actually no. Never mind. So as you said, it's not going to be. It would be a breaking change to have API additions like this, right? So if we can come up with. Okay.
I don't know enough about validation. I think Fowler's argument here is also that these are independent things. Like one of them is just giving you access to the data. And then there's this whole other thing that they have in ASP.NET, right, with options, which I'm not actually that familiar with it anymore. But like the way I understand is that configuration is just an abstraction over the storage. And then options was the thing that gives you like a strongly typed thing for that, or a thing they can also monitor for changes and stuff. And I think what he's arguing is that validation belongs into that, so that people don't double validate. But I'm.
And to your point, the options, which helps with validation, already kind of covers the scenario. And probably what David said is that like that is something that happens at startup unless someone wants to do validation before startup, but we'll see what they think, what their response is.
But this looks very. I mean, I swear to God, we at some point looked at something that had to do with get required. Maybe it was get required service or something, but like
get required service, yeah.
Okay. Because that looks very familiar. Okay, then let's just do the same thing here. Let's just say this is
needs. Thanks for the quick review.
Absolutely. All right, so then let's do that. Was anybody else earlier in line? Otherwise, I would just walk top to bottom.
I'm as parallel the first one. Yeah. I marked it as ready for.
Oh yeah, okay, so that makes sense because I was thinking there was somebody else involved because I remember fighting that, but I think I filed it from a list, so you probably have more context than I do.
So the idea here is that if an invocation of the asParallel method is found by an analyzer, and we detect that the previous concatenated invocations were other link queries like selector were, we should suggest to move the asParallel invocation to the first position. And there are two cases for this. One is the for each, and the other one is when saving the return value into a variable. And there's a very good summary in a related issue with examples given by Stephen. So I thought that this could be split into the two cases. One is when you find it, when the analyzer finds this case in the for each, and the other one when it's found anywhere else. And we can decide if we want one case to be addressed and the other one not, or if we want both to be approved for the analyzer.
I think to me
There's
these
more info in the bottom.
yeah, to me these kind of like I think analyzer wise it's kind of up for you to decide how you want to implement this. I think the question for us is I guess more about whether they should have independent diagnostic IDs. That's really the decision point for the user experience, right? Because if you implement them as one analyzer, you can still have different diagnostics IDs that you raise from these cases. My personal take is that things that are closely related, like these ones, I'm fine with saying they have the same diagnostic ID. Like the question really becomes like, would you suppress one but not the other? And if you can't come up with a case where you would do that, it seems like having them in the same ID makes sense because you would treat them as the same thing. I don't know enough about the Roslyn fixer infrastructure to see whether that will constrain your ability to fix stuff in an easy way. Because I think my understanding is that sometimes when you register a fixer, you basically say, I only fix this ID. And then if the fixer is drastically different between the two, there might be some benefit of having different IDs as well. But you can probably handle that either way, would be my guess. I mean, it seems like a reasonable fix. A reasonable.
Yeah. My
analyzer.
recollection from when working on an analyzer is that Manish said that the tooltip will pop up if any analyzers or any fixers say that they can respond to this diagnostic, and then if it has no fix, then you get this weird, I have a fix for you. No, I don't. Experience. So
I think in this case, like there are sort of two fixers that one could imagine. One of them is remove the call, and one of them is move the call earlier. And the remove the call is always valid. The move it earlier only applies if there were operations before it that made sense to move to. But since at least one of them is always valid, I think they could be the same diagnostic ID, and then the fixer that moved it earlier would just not offer itself, but the one that was for removal would always. I think the user experience would be fine. I'd suggest
fixers offer themselves only by ID. They can't look at the code before they offer themselves up.
Is that true?
Yeah, apparently
that's my
that's
recollection
true.
of what Manish said. That's where you get the lightning bolt or the light bulb, and then you click on the thing and it's like, oh nope, I actually evaluated that thing since you hit the fly out, and it says this no longer applies, and then the light bulb immediately comes back because you've closed the light bulb. That's my recollection. So I feel like, I mean, we can try getting that confirmed. If that's true, I think we would want one diagnostic for as parallel used at the end of a link query, and another for as parallel used on an IEnumerable with no other context.
But I guess what I'm not understanding is if there's an opportunity for a fixer to decide that it doesn't want to offer itself, if another fixer always decides that it does, what is the bad user experience?
Because again, my recollection, the fixers have titles, and when you hit the light bulb, it has the fly out of like, oh, here's this title of a fixture that you can run, and then you hit the fix, and it's like, yeah, it didn't actually apply.
Well, I think they run I think what ends up happening is the light bulb, meaning the just a small pop-up that you can click, I think only appears when any analyzer says, I have a fixer for this diagnostic. But as soon as you invoke the light bulb, I think the analyzers run. And so basically in the bad user experience, you just end up with an empty menu. But as soon as titles show, I think they already ran and decided that they're applicable. So
right, that was my thinking as well. And that if there was always going to be at least one for the diagnostic ID, then it wouldn't matter. But regardless, this is effectively an implementation detail.
Yeah.
If we need two IDs, we use two IDs. If we don't, we don't.
I think to me that's kind of a problem with the Roslyn infrastructure, because they kind of, it almost seems like that you have to kind of always have independent IDs for every fixer because you don't know the context in which they show up.
Yeah, so I guess that to Steve's statement, it's use one diagnostic unless testing says that you have to use two.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
Yeah, which means that you really need to look at the VS experience and not just whether the fixer test passed. So there has to be sort of a judgment call.
Or ask Manish, he'll be able to tell you off the top of his head what we should do.
Or ask Manish.
It's like the value task rule. Okay, so I guess there's not much.
So I guess really it's also a question of, would they get different? Would you want different help text on it for you've used as parallel as a standalone method, like in the second for each example here, versus you've used as parallel at the end of a list. I assume we don't want the analyzer to report, I think you could have moved it earlier. We just only want to report if it's in a terminal position. Steve.
Sorry, what was the question, Jordan?
So if you have so select where as parallel, obviously you did that wrong.
Yes.
Select as parallel where, is that obviously wrong?
No.
Right. So the analyzer only works when as parallel is the terminal statement.
So with that is one valid approach. I think that would be fine. We also could potentially imbue the analyzer with some knowledge of what plink is capable of. For example, if it's as parallel .toArray end, then there's nothing that the as parallel can do for that toArray. That's or to list or one of them. I forget which it is. So, but I think we're better off starting with the former case and only selectively adding in anything from the latter case if it's meaningful.
And again, just thinking through things. So mainly, Carlos, this is your unit test matrix. That it's fine to be the terminal thing in a statement as long as it's being assigned to a I parallel queryable or whatever the.
Yeah, you could
if you're not losing type identity, then
I think it should be restricted purely to for eaches, because the moment you assign these things to variables, you can tack on additional stuff subsequently.
I guess that's true. Even if you saved it as IEnumerable, gluing on the where will evaluate as a parallel where.
Well, no.
No?
It's based on type identity.
Okay, so that one's matching based on the extension off the interface. Yeah. Okay. Check.
So in fact, there's a link. Plink has an as sequential operator in addition to as parallel, and all it does return this as IEnumerable, basically.
Nice.
So yeah, I mean, potentially it could detect that. To your point, Jeremy, it could detect that case as well. If as parallel is being assigned into an IEnumerable, it could detect that too, I guess.
Okay.
Are you guys okay with the severity and messaging?
I think messages are it's just an implementation detail. We can decide depending on how we're going to solve the problem, if it's going to be one ID or two. So it doesn't matter much, the messages. Maybe to Jeremy's point, we should make sure that we mention that it's in a terminal position. But what matters more is the severity. Is it something that we need to decide here?
Yeah, it's part of the API.
Okay. So we've suggested to use a severity warning in my comment. Would that make sense?
I think it does. I think the question for almost all these severities, I think, is the proof is in the pudding, right? You run it on several repos and you see how much of the false positive rate you're getting. I mean, it seems like you should not get any because hopefully we're not writing buggy code. But I mean, there might be some nuance where, there may be some cases where people do that and it's actually not a bug, it's by design. But I can't think of a case for this particular example. But until you actually run it, you probably don't know whether that's the case or not. So I would say, I would be okay with saying, yeah, warning seems fine. Of course, predicated on the fact that we don't have too many false positives.
Yeah, I mean, error doesn't seem justified. Warning seems reasonable.
I mean, error seems generally only applicable when you really know things will not work at runtime. It will work, it's just not going to be fast, right? Or not parallelized, I should say.
Yeah. And
Yeah, I have
I
trouble
assume
when
this
you
is
have, like,
TFM locked.
I mean, this is arguably a perf fix. However, you're using an API specifically focused on you believe it's improving your perf. So like APIs where we say use, string.indexUp instead of string.compare or vice versa. And we say that's better for perf, but like you may not have cared about perf, so we really shouldn't treat that as a warning. That's really just a suggestion. But
Right.
here, you're obviously caring about that domain, and so I think, and you're doing it wrong. So I think a warning as our initial kind of, out of the gate decision makes sense. We can always lower it.
Yeah, I think to me it's less about perf versus non-perf. It's more about you use an API and the way you use it is incorrect, right? And we know that statically,
Yeah.
right? And I think that to me is the bar for warning.
Yeah. But this is, I mean, the category listed in the top suggests reliability, but I think performance as a category, and that it probably more appropriately applies. Like, there's nothing like calling this API has no impact on the reliability of your program. It's just you added an object creation that you didn't need.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, like I was thinking correctness because you're not correctly using the API, but you're right. You're not crashing. You're not producing incorrect results. It's just that what you think is happening is not actually happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if we have a category called correctness, then sure.
To me, correctness though would still imply that the user would see different results, right? As in you're computing. You're calling APIs, we kind of know what you're looking for, but the way you call the API will give you the wrong result. This one will not give you the wrong result. It will just not perform in the way you expect, right? So I guess performance would still be fair as the category.
Yeah, so when we say warning, do we expect this to be using the whatever we called waves, or that this is just on in the next version of the package?
So my understanding, and that is something that I probably should double check, but the way I understand the setup right now is that basically everything that has a separate ID can be decided to be in or out based on TFM. So basically it means if you're in .NET 5, given that it's a net new ID, it wouldn't show up until we manually decide to do that. And by default, we generally wouldn't, right? That's my understanding.
Because I thought, and I could be wrong, that whatever we write in the class itself as what its default is what happens unless we change that in config. So the default is if we write that it is warning, then it's warning. And then it applies to anywhere that can find the appropriate members. And if it's if we want it off by default, I think that means we have to in code say its default is none or IDE suggestion, and then edit the config file to say that for net 6 it's warning.
I mean, you probably know more about the infrastructure than I do. Like, if that's the case, it seems kind of busted though, because it means you basically have to, moving forward, configure everything in a file somewhere, because, I mean, unless you can say in the analyzer this is applicable to this TFM, which I don't think you can. So that means the default would generally be useless, right?
Most of them we end up having it just like, I guess a lot of the ones we did went in the same version that we introduced an API, and it's talking about that API. So you could not have had this on a previous version. So we got to use the code default.
Gotcha.
This one does apply to existing code. And so if we wanted the TFM model, then we just need to make sure that what we're saying is it's warning with net 6 or higher.
Yeah, I think
off by default.
Maybe I'm thinking this the wrong way. I think maybe they expose the warning waves in code as well. So if you can tie to the warning wave in your default, then it should be easy. If you can't, then yes, you probably have to go to some file. Yeah, because you would tie to the warning wave of 6, right? Because you would say, well, it's existing code, and you would opt in by TFM or by manually configuring the rule.
Yeah, I think I don't think it's in code. I think code is what happens if warning waves throttle it up or down. I
mean, that's a general question, like how do we make sure we don't fuck this up, right? Because do we have a test for that actually verifies that we didn't add new diagnostics in an existing warning wave?
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly do that in tests, because you can tell the test build as, net 461, and then this shouldn't pop, and then say build it as net 6, and now it pops.
Yeah, I wouldn't do this for like I guess, I mean, you could probably do it per diagnostic, but I would more like have a generic case that detects that, oh, we shipped 5 with 500 warnings on, or 500 diagnostic IDs on. Can we just check the IDs and say, oh yeah, you have one test that says, oh sorry, you just added, you know, these 5 diagnostic IDs, or these 5. I guess the question is not the IDs. You would say these analyzers are considered on, and they weren't considered on before, right? Instead of running them all, you would just statically determine that there's more analyzers in scope than before, and fail that one. That seems more like a reliable test. Otherwise, it's a per diagnostic test case everybody has to remember doing, right?
Maybe. I don't know what they. I don't remember what they have in place. Like, I got lucky. The only ones I worked on were locked to API in the same version that we were shipping the analyzer in, so I didn't have to deal with waves.
All right,
I just got to be in the meetings.
I'll ask. All right, so then I think we discussed this analyzer to death.
Did you change the category to
I
performance?
did not change the category. I did change the category.
Thanks.
Absolutely. And then I think the rest was just some random order, right? Unless there's preferences, I would again walk top to bottom.
Can we go with tracing one?
Oh, that's
this
right.
is the one.
You're still on
This is the one.
All right, this is the one?
It was already the one at the top.
So, good for you. Do you want to talk about it then, Tarek?
Yeah, sure. If you go down a little bit more. Yeah, there is a comment for me down there. Yeah.
That you
no, that down. Sorry, one more. Yeah, here. Okay. So basically, in 5 release, we have exposed a new APIs, which is activity source, and it had method is called start activity, which is have a couple of overloads there. And one, I mean, the first parameter of our overload is always the name of the activity. That if you want to create a new tracing activity, so you have to give it a name. So we got the scenario recently about like people need to have the caller member name on the name parameter, so they don't have to provide the name, and they want to get the caller name instead automatically. And we looked, and it looks like this will be like kind of common scenario. I mean, like will be common scenario. People start using it like across different components, and that I mean, like it will be helpful scenario for them. So if you see about like, you know, in the top of my comment, we have these 2 overload, which is we currently have today. And the proposal is for the first overload, we will just add the caller member name attribute to the name parameter. So it's just adding the attribute only to this signature. I talked offline with Jeremy, and we believe that because we don't have any other overloads that takes default name parameter, so this shouldn't be a breaking change. This is the first one. Second one is like we will also need to pass more parameters. I mean, like activity kind. And we are proposing the second extra overload, which is at the bottom of my comment here, is adding this overload, and last parameter, it will be the string name, which is defaulted with the caller member name attribute. So that's the proposal. So in short, I mean, like we adding just attribute to one of the existing overloads, and we're adding extra overload here.
And to be clear, the type
is the long overload and then moving string to the end, so you can default it.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So what type are they supposed to go on these methods?
Activity source.
I see. Okay, that explains why I can't find them.
So you added the one that currently starts as string activity kind activity context but there's
Yes.
also one that's string activity kind string. Do you not want that overload to also allow defaulting the name?
I think the people want to provide the activity kind more, so the context is not requested yet, but they still have what proposed overload is still can be used in this scenario also when giving the activity context, right?
Well, but you're adding the one that takes kind followed by context, but then there's another overload that takes kind followed by the string of the parent ID instead of the context of the parent context.
Yeah, I mean, parent ID is not, is not common scenario now. I mean, we are trying to promote the activity context. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So it also seems to me like in your overload you suggest parent context and links would have to be optional as well, right? They have to be nullable because you initialize them to default. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah, so the new overload, the only parameter that it's not defaulted is the kind, which is, this is what requested also in the top of the thread.
So the first one already exists, correct? It's just you're proposing to add the attribute, right?
That's right, yes.
Well, and to default the parameter.
Yeah.
Yes, I see. So that means people can now call sort activity without passing any arguments, which they couldn't before. They could call one with only passing in the name. We would make that optional as well.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And then so what's the So that I didn't quite understand the thing. So why do you propose in the second overload that name is last?
Because name has to be defaulted, so we cannot move it to the top. And in same time, I mean, like we have the activity kind, the first parameter in the overload. This is not defaulted.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, and moving it to being the last parameter makes sense to me if we do expect that the overwhelming majority of people just want the method name, because that way now, if they wanted the kind in the parent context, they don't need to skip over the name parameter, so they don't need to use the name parameter invocation syntax.
Yeah.
I see.
Which basically, I don't think we ever talk about caller member name in the guidelines, but basically I think it, like cancellation token, it wants to be as last as it can.
Yeah, because the whole point is you would never ever want to set it to anything, yeah.
Yeah.
I see. So now I think I understand Jeremy's other question, and I think Tarek answered it with we don't care, correct, for the parent ID?
Yeah. So far, at least, I mean, like
Yeah, I mean, it
seems good to me.
Looks reasonable. I mean, as reasonable as APIs to take like 12 arguments are, but yeah. Especially all the generic instantiation stuff does not help.
Yep. I mean, the good news is none of these are virtual, so
yeah.
We don't have complications of that.
We can make them virtual.
Oh, come on, Tarek. I thought we were friends.
Okay, let me just add one more thing. Cool. Done.
Thank you.
Steven, you're up again. One on use of
Yeah.
module initializer.
Yeah. So, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. We added a new feature in C#9 that lets you declare module initializers, which have always been supported by the runtime, but they were impossible to sort of use without complicated techniques. Now you can just slap module initializer on your static method and it becomes one. But it's become clear from a variety of discussions that we would not advocate this for being used in general libraries. And in particular, we would want this across .NET runtime to prohibit people like me from accidentally adding these. So the proposal here is, I think, probably an off by default analyzer that we can turn on in .NET runtime. And that would basically just, if you use module initializer, we say,
So let me get this straight. We added a feature that we basically think we shouldn't use. Is that the story?
In general purpose libraries. The problem is you end up with, you're sort of subject to the whim of the runtime as to when these run. And so you end up with potential ordering issues between multiple libraries and kind of, there are alternatives. You can do lazy initialization with static constructors and things like that. So for application level concerns, these can make complete sense, but for library concerns, and I'm using we sort of liberally, don't believe in them.
So when you say
He's
libraries, you
looking at me,
mean
Levi.
application level libraries rather than general purpose libraries?
Yeah.
Because I mean, in an actual XE, it doesn't make much sense, right? Because you clearly control your startups. You might as well call the method at that point.
This could also make sense for use in source generators. You know, an app is using a source generator to spit some code and wants some other stuff to run when the app loads.
Can you have more than one in one module?
Yes.
I see, and they all run in whatever order.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
That's one of the problems with them.
The compiler emits a single module initializer that calls all of the annotated methods in the order that it parsed them, which is generally the order that in modern .NET SDK projects will be alphabetical order. But that's no different than the declaration ordering issues with static field initializers across
Right.
partial classes.
Which we know are not a problem at all.
Is the scan order? I'm just curious, Tanner. Is the scan order deterministic? Because I know that they do they use parallelism for file loads.
Yeah, it's deterministic, but it's technically an implementation detail in what order that a compiler decides to emit them. Some other implementation of the compiler could decide to not do it in parse order, for example.
I was just curious if a slow disk read would change the order between recompiles.
Nope, they've spec'd it as deterministic, but implementation defined as to the order that it's emitted.
Fair enough. Yeah, so why do you think off by default, Steve, instead of on by default, and it says turn this off if you're an application?
Just because
I assume we don't
it's,
need to know that.
I mean, it could be a suggestion, I guess. It just feels like something that is a strong policy to wield, and that, I don't know, it just feels a little wrong to me to kind of force it upon people. That said, there's gonna be like 2 people using this, and maybe they should know what they're going, what they're in for. So I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion. It definitely shouldn't be a warning by default.
I think having it on by default might be fine, given that this is meant to be a niche case feature. The actual concern I would have is whether or not that starts showing up for source generators if they do start using it more frequently.
Yeah, you have the option in analyzers to say whether it applies to generated code or not. I assume we would turn that off.
Yeah, I mean the analyzer or generated code could also just pragma warning suppress right before they declare it. So
in which case I would think that it's fine to just have it on by default, and the you know, Unity and other authors that are probably going to use this can just disable it as an explicit opt-in to I want to use initializers. I understand the issues in this link document, etc.
I mean, it seems to me it's a net new feature, right? And it's fairly advanced, and we believe 99% of people shouldn't use it. So why would we not make it a warning by default?
Yeah, I'm good with warning by default. And if there's too much pushback on that, then I would think a warning of you have two of them in the same compile unit.
No, you're really
sorry,
screwed.
That means file. You have two of them in the same assembly. Be aware this is a very, very low level feature with, I don't even know if I don't know what levels of safety happen. You're before CC TORs, right? So. So yeah, definitely 2+ feels like a warning to me. That gets weird with generated code because the question is, which one did you find first? I'm happy with warning by default because it's a power feature, and the people who would want to use it know how to turn off warnings.
So all right, so that was easy. And from there on, it's just file order. Jeremy, that's yours.
Yep. So we added some methods at the end of 5 for making it easier to create certificates, specifically from where you have the cert in one file and a key in another, and then someone came up with the use case after it's too late to put it in 5 that if they have a certificate that's PIM encoded and they don't care about the key, and it's already loaded in as a string, that all that they have to do is run it through UTF-8 get bytes or ASCII get bytes, but that's not obvious. And since we already have the create from PIM method family, then the suggestion is add create from PIM that reads a string like. And since the create from PIMs that we added that read the string likes didn't also add string, this one doesn't add string. So it's a overload to an existing method. The existing one takes a cert PIM and a key PIM, and it fails if it can't find a key across the two of them. This one does not throw if it can't find a key. In fact, it won't look for a key.
I mean, it seems very reasonable. The existing one is keys also last, so it actually overloads nicely. I think it makes sense.
Yeah. And actually, I think the current one, the cert PIM parameter, it will only look for the certificate. Key PIM, it will only look for the key. And when you open it from a file, it passes the same buffer into both, unless you gave 2 files. So we don't need the create from file on this one because it honestly it's too complicated. So cool.
Sounds good.
Sorry, Jeremy. We already have some create methods, or this is what do we already have?
Yeah. So we added create from PIM and create from PIM file at the end of 5. Create from PIM, which is you already have it in memory. It takes cert PIM and the key PIM. And
I see. This is just adding an overload that takes a span.
Well, it's adding one that gets rid of the key parameter. So just the cert.
I see.
And now we'll find out if Emo has updated this or not.
Oh, that's why. Yeah, so I have a new website. I'm looking at my own copy of it. Let me just page this one over.
Yeah, I mean, the other option would be we could take the one that takes a certain key and make it not fail if it can't find a key in key, but that feels wrong. So
yeah, so here are the existing ones, a bunch of them. And this is the one that would be overloaded.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's overloading this one too.
This is just an overload that doesn't have the second argument.
Correct.
Just curious, what happens today if you pass an empty span as a second argument?
It will fail because it couldn't find a key that matched the certificate.
So there's a behavior difference between empty span and calling the other overload.
Yeah.
That's probably not unreasonable, because I think we have this probably in other places in the framework as well. I think if it were typed as string, probably we would want the behavior for null to be the same as calling the single argument one, but I think empty string seems reasonable to me. I guess a null span technically is an empty span, so there is no difference.
Right. Well, I mean, so it doesn't fail because it was empty. It fails because it couldn't find a key. So you give it null, you give it empty, you give it the string hello. Like none of those have a key inside it. So,
right.
And that was, I don't remember the reason, but it was intentional.
Yeah.
It only becomes a little weird when we add the one arg variant. But
yeah, unless somebody feels strongly, I think that's okay.
And here, let me pretend to be emo. It's crypto.
Pretty good impression. I think
This is crypto? Oh yeah, I don't care.
Yeah. I need some slightly more German vowels, but otherwise I think I captured emo's care level.
All right, Jeff, this is one of yours again.
Yep, this is another socket API completeness issue. This is a sync API that we never spanified, so the proposal is spanified.
Awesome.
As part of spanification, do you also want an overload that takes file name as rosh_char, or is that not reasonable in context?
I didn't even consider it. I suppose we can consider it.
I can't imagine people would be calling this with a file name that's not in a string.
Fair enough. I asked the question. I was just glancing across, and it's like, we're spanifying. I'm like, where are we span? It says string. So, and then
it probably wouldn't hurt to have a span of char, but it would feel a bit contrived. Yeah.
It would be contrived. Yeah. I'm also not a huge fan of using rosh_char into APIs that tend to be involved in p-invokes, because it encourages people to do things like ignore any null terminators that might be required.
Yeah, and that would be a good reason. If that needs to pass a null terminated string down, then using rosh_char is actually sad. Yeah, I think generally we haven't done it for file names.
Alrighty. I think it's another one for Jeff.
That's popular today.
Oh, that's the one I just assigned to him. You're faster than. It's like, okay, that's not for today. Let's do the other ones.
How did that pop to the top? I thought your sort was oldest,
Yeah, I
unless
don't
it was
know.
blocking. Oh, because it's 6 and the rest are future.
Yeah, I think that's how that happened. Yeah, because I ordered first by release and then I did. All right, so who marked this one? Eric. Is Eric on the call? Probably not, right? Nope. Then let's skip this one. Same. That's probably Levi, right? Yep.
Where are we? So I want to find anything other than a space or anything other than a comma, stuff like that. It's if you're implementing something like a really naive or really domain-specific trim function, something like this could be useful. Because you would say, I want to find anything that's not a, as I mentioned earlier, I want to find anything that's not a literal space character. Just like tell me where the index of anything not of space is. Not of any is similar. It's I don't want A or B or C. I want anything else other than those. This is there would be no linguistic overloads of this. Everything here would be ordinal. So there would be no equivalent of like string comparison dot invariant culture that you could pass in, because that operation just doesn't make sense with this API.
I mean,
a kind of uncommon operation to need. Is there something we're unblocking with this?
There is not, and that was actually one of the things that was brought up in the comments here. I think this is more of a nice to have for libraries that might have written such code themselves, but within the framework, I don't think we have much use for it.
Yeah, I mean, really, the not infix feels weird to me. Like, especially once you get to the index not of any. Like,
yeah.
Really, to me, that's more like index of any except.
I mean,
and then index of except and.
I mean, what is the argument that the framework has it? Is it just because we can accelerate it with SIMD intrinsics?
And to be honest, there was a discussion in the issue here where I had actually advocated not SIMD accelerating it, because I think in the majority of cases it will actually terminate early.
Right.
But yeah,
I mean, I think my concern with these APIs is like ignore the naming. It's just like I think we go down this path of like now exponential combinations of these things, and at that point, memory extensions becomes like Tanner's intrinsics APIs, where we have like 6-word combinations of things, right? Where it seems you're chasing the, more and more unlikely cases.
So, with regards to accelerating it or not, I think that we'd want to, even if it does terminate quickly, because there's no real cost to doing that. You have one additional check in practice. But I also agree, I don't think we want a huge explosion of APIs here. And I imagine that every one of these will possibly expand if we end up getting the ref field and value array support with C# 10.
Yeah, like this, maybe this could be an example of something the community could do. But maybe in a non.NET package. But I mean, I shouldn't say we have no use cases in the framework. We have very limited use cases in the framework. And I don't think the number of use cases we have ourselves is sufficient to justify this work. But there is, a potential that this could be useful to third parties. And because we provide building blocks, should we consider providing this building block? I mean, that is kind of our job. I don't know. I'm very ambivalent on this.
I do think the not case is useful for some scenarios, particularly with buffers where you're wanting to find the first character that doesn't match something else, for example. You might have sparse data, for example, where you have a number of indices set to -1, and you want to find the first non-negative value to find the first actual entry you want to work with.
Sure, but in that case, do you actually have to search for a pattern, or do you have to search for the non-existence of a single character or a single byte?
You would do index not of buffer -1. In which case you want to find the first entry in that buffer, which is not -1.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can see this being useful in that it, saves you some sort of, time when you write a parser, right? But like at the same time, I really feel like you're now in the long tail of utility methods.
Maybe it's something that we could not ship as part of the framework, but maybe this is one of those cases where it might be a good community managed project which contains a bunch of SIMD accelerated sort and search functions for things like span and array, because I don't think there's anything preventing a user from implementing these functions.
Right, and to Tanner's earlier example, like I would probably get value out of a function which was give me the first index of any non-negative number from this array, which would also handle sparse arrays, presumably.
Yeah, but that's specialized. That's not find a thing that's not -1.
Correct, and that's why I'm wondering, like, if we actually had scenarios for stuff like that, would those kinds of APIs be more useful than an API which is give me the first thing that is not this exact element? Like, do we actually open the door to a wider variety of things just working out of box if we provided those other APIs instead of this?
Maybe.
But because we don't have that list of scenarios offhand, I don't think we can consider it here.
I mean, I would venture a guess and say these APIs that proposed here seem like something you would use in parsing, right? When you actually try to like hand write regex effectively, right? I don't think you would use that for sparse arrays necessarily. Like the example that Ben provided was clearly parsing, right? Because he was looking for white space or something, or the first non-white space, I guess. Right?
Yeah,
that's
but
the typical code you would write when you say, skip everything that is a white space.
Yes, and we have trim functions which are more efficient than these.
Well, that's kind of...
I mean, the one case I can think of, and I noted this in the list, the one case that I can think of in the framework falls into that category, and that's within regex. Like when you say, when there are loops that are basically consume everything of the following thing until you find something that's not. And so like if you have /s or, white space star, you need to find the first thing that's not. And so we would, I think that's like, we would end up using this there. We don't need it. We currently open code that, and we can continue doing so. This would just save a little bit of code in that one case.
Yeah, but I also feel like they are probably very specialized, right? Because you probably want to tune them to your needs anyway. So
Yeah, and this was also discussed in the issue here. We would not write string.trim based on this, because string.trim, we have other performance tricks that we do in order to make that fast. And we have assumptions on how most strings are generated that this would not be able to do in the general case.
Yeah, I think realistically this just falls into the category of the implementation is trivial unless you're wanting a performant implementation. And in that case, I think it falls into the general category of general array operations, which might need their own library.
Okay.
And not necessarily in the BCL.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a question of if we're going to recommend it as a community product, should we talk about, naming and signatures, or not care? I don't know what our expected involvement
I
is
mean,
supposed
honestly, I wouldn't even encourage a user-defined library for this. I would just say this is not a good candidate for the BCL. If somebody else wants to do it, they can. But I don't even want to be in the business of like partially API reviewing some community editions unless we have an actual model for this.
So maybe should we consider just saying, if you're interested, submit it to CoreFX Lab, and we won't do an API review?
Aren't we getting rid of CoreFX Lab?
Yeah, I mean, both. I mean, to me, CoreFX Lab and Runtime Lab kind of imply that there's a graduation path, right? And if we feel like we don't want to have this in the product, I would honestly just say, good idea, but sorry, no. I mean, like if enough people say this is useful, right, we might change our mind. But I think at this point, knowing Ben, I would say it's a very specialized use case. And sure, at the surface it doesn't look bad, but I'm not convinced yet.
Okay.
I mean, we very rarely close API requests, right? So I also feel like it's not the worst in the world to just say no.
Okay, that's fine. Let's go ahead and close it then.
Since we're closing it, I don't think that you really need to copy and paste what the code was.
Well, it's like in the notes, it seems easier if you actually know what was proposed.
Fair enough.
But yeah. All right. I think this is Jeff again, would be my guess. Yep.
It's the one you already tried
that's
closing.
The one that
it was at the top of the list still.
Still the same one. All right. And that's the same font. It's probably Eric, right? Yep. Let's close this one. Okay, so then that's the configuration one again. Okay, what is this one? Is Miriam still in the call, or she dropped off, right? Yeah. Then let's skip this one as well. I think no. Our good friend Tanner is going.
So this one's pretty simple. Some hardware provides specialized operations for performing the reciprocal. So 1 over x, or 1 over, or estimating the square root, or 1 over the square root of x. And so this is just proposing we expose an official API under math that allows users to easily consume these. It's not guaranteed that it would be an estimate. Some platform could, for example, decide to implement it just as 1 over x, but on our hardware that does provide it, we would just invoke down into that.
There are places where I would have used this. I'm curious, is there some sort of minimum expectation of accuracy here?
Both ARM and x86 provide some minimal guarantee, which is like 12 ULP, but I don't think we would formally define a requirement as part of the API surface.
I mean, it would be similar to anything else we have on math, right? It's kind of like best effort, right?
Yeah, this is basically just a way for users to explicitly opt into a fast math optimization that C++ compilers have. We don't have fast math in C# or .NET in general. So this allows them to explicitly opt into it when it's appropriate.
And presumably we have intrinsics for those, but the value that these provide is that they do the if this platform call this, if this platform call this, right?
Correct, and provide a software fallback.
Right.
Is the software fallback, does the software fallback have acceptable performance guarantees?
It would just be 1 over x.
So it would be
Not worse.
It would be no better than calling the give me the actual answer method.
Correct.
Is that acceptable in these scenarios? Because it seems that the only reason you would want to call these is because the existing APIs are insufficient as far as performance is concerned.
That's similar to fuse multiply add, where you typically want it because it's faster, not just because it provides more accuracy. Some libraries like libc do actually provide macros or global constants that define whether or not it is fast. I didn't put those up as part of this proposal, but we could theoretically expose something like, is reciprocal estimate accelerated?
I guess, yeah, that's the question I'm driving at. Like if I know, sorry, is there a scenario in which I don't want to call these unless I know for a fact that they're actually faster than doing the fallback?
Performance-oriented code.
But the only scenario for calling this is performance-oriented code, right?
I mean, I'm kind of confused. Like, to me, if the provided functionality is never slower than what you would do normally, I think it's fine. I think the problem with vector was that if you write vectorized code, the code you write is extremely different, right? So the software fallback is sometimes like 2x or 3x slower than what a naive loop would have been if it's not accelerated, right? But it seems in this case you do 1 divided by x, so presumably you have to compute 1 divided by x in your algorithm. And if you do it by hand, or if you call this API, so long this is never slower than what you do by hand, it seems fine.
Yeah, and we can document that if you're using Ryujit and you're on x86 or ARM, then we will accelerate.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is basically, it's slower on systems that are on architectures that don't have whatever the equivalent instruction is, and that's
all the platforms we support today.
I wouldn't even say
not
it's
including
slower.
what Mono supports.
It's just not faster.
Yeah.
Okay, so in practice, no one's ever going to run into this as a problem, unless maybe you're targeting like browser or something.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
In which case, we already have other places where code you might think is fast is not fast.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. If in practice this won't be an issue, then I'm not worried about it.
I think that, to me, I would like to avoid this whole, like, let's add a Boolean somewhere that says whether it's accelerated or not, because then math will become, super convoluted, right, API-wise. I think this is meant to be a one-stop shop. If you really care about the performance at that point, yeah, you use the intrinsics yourself. If you're at that level of care, then...
And if we were to expose such an API, given that it's potentially extensible in the future, I'd probably propose it as it's a method that takes an enum, and therefore the JIT can constant fold it, but we don't need a ton of surface area. We just have to add new enum values as we move forward. But I also don't think we need that today.
You don't want CPU flags that tells you what things are supported. You want has CPU flag, and
yeah.
Tanner, is there a like math H for half?
No, there isn't, and that's something that we've had the previous discussions around, and we didn't decide whether or not we were going to add a math H or whether or not we were going to move methods onto single, double, half, or things like that. Part of that being that we weren't sure what C# was going to do with shapes, and if they were going to need to implement new interfaces like was proposed by the Mono team, or if something else was going to happen.
All right, so then I think we can approve this API as is, and then do our lunch break.
Yep. And I assume that X is what we call it in square root, and I guess square root's probably the only one that existed.
Yes, for float. I think on double it might actually be called D instead of X. It's one of those inconsistencies that cropped up between the ref and the source, and between code that was 20 years old and code that's 2 years old now.
Well, we have it all, right?
Yeah, we've actually...
Really, it's,
AB.
really it's what's Squirt called.
We've got XD value A, B, C. We've got all kinds of names in here.
Right, but square root and square root estimate should match. So what's square root saying?
D.
Okay.
Are we going to pull in the what was it, John Carmack arcsign function?
We already have arcsign.
Awesome.
It's called as in.
And then there's a proposal 2 down that we're not getting to today for adding math.signCos, which computes both
Ooh.
simultaneously. Mathf is just it's X.
It's X everywhere. So then presumably we would also make this one D then for simplicity, or if we leave this as X.
Probably D for consistency. Honestly, I'd like to just take the breaking change and go and fix all of these to be like value or something.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, like that seems like maybe not the worst idea, because I mean, who's calling them by actually naming the arguments on the call side? I'd be shocked.
And if they
estimate D colon val. Yeah.
and if they are, it's a 1-character fix.
Right, it's just annoying, right? But like,
Yeah.
And something
and
tells me you don't call them the dynamic either. So
there's also the potential you could theorize we ship an analyzer that says, hey, we've actually renamed the parameter in reciprocal estimate from X to value. Let's offer a code fix for if they were explicitly calling a method named this with the wrong name, then offer the code fix to fix it across the solution.
Yeah, or even one that just applies to all TFMs. It's like, this has an inconsistent name. We recommend you don't use the name to call syntax.
Yeah.
Right.
Tanner, follow-up question. Is there anything that needs to be noted with regard to exceptions, interrupts, whatever, with these APIs?
No, floating point doesn't throw exceptions.
Okay, awesome.
All right, then I think that's it for today. Then thanks for everyone on the call. Thanks everybody who was watching us on YouTube. And then I see you next week. Bye-bye.
Ciao.